On a morning soaked in wet fog and pale light, the village of Trenum awoke to the distant tolling of the church bells. 5 distinct strikes, slow and deliberate, each spaced apart by the same cold silence that gripped the valley. In this rural corner of Ohio where fields met thick woods and horses knew the sound of every human footstep, the bell was a sacred measure of time and mortality. 1 toll meant passing, 5 meant a tragedy. But that day, there was no death notice tacked to the chapel door, no grieving family wrapped in shawls, no procession of black hats or wooden carts wheeling caskets down the gravel lane, just the sound. Then the stillness, and then the quiet shuffle of townsfolk who behaved as though the bells had simply been a mistake. Not a single window opened, no candle flickered behind drawn curtains. Shopkeepers arranged their produce. The baker lit his oven. The children were kept home without explanation. Something had changed in the bones of the village, yet no one would speak its name. The parish itself stood at the village's edge, tall and too wide for such a small community. The bell tower loomed like a finger pointing toward judgment. At the base of it, the doors remained closed that morning. No smoke drifted from the rectory chimney. No priest was seen outside, and still the bells had rung. Not automatically. They had to be pulled, hauled by hand from inside, each one requiring deliberate effort, a purpose. The town's elderly gravedigger, Harmon Skews, walked the perimeter of the cemetery that day with his head down and shovel in hand, though he did not dig. His boots were clean, yet by noon 5 fresh mounds of earth had risen behind the far hedge near the back of the cemetery, precisely the number the bells had signaled. No names carved, no stones set, just simple wooden markers with no markings, identical, faceless. Children whispered that they saw someone moving in the fog that morning, gliding behind the trees near the church. Some said it was a woman in white. Others said it was Father Kreil, though no one had seen him arrive yet. He was not due for another week. The previous priest had died in winter, his body found frozen at his writing desk with ink still wet on the page. The bishop's letter had promised a replacement by spring, but no one had confirmed his arrival, no carriage was seen on the road, and no name was spoken aloud in public. Still, something had moved those bells, and something had buried those coffins. At supper, silence clung to the village homes like soot. Families ate in long silences, chewing slowly as though afraid the sound might invite something in. A few townspeople walked to the edge of the cemetery at dusk, but stopped short of entering. They stood just long enough to count the 5 fresh graves. No one asked questions. Questions would be remembered, and in Trenum, to be remembered was dangerous. That night a thick fog rolled in again and stayed heavy against the windows, as if trying to press its way inside. Weeks passed and no deaths were reported. The town ledger remained blank. School resumed. The blacksmith reshod horses as usual. But some things had shifted. Birds avoided the steeple. Milk curdled faster. A fine gray dust began appearing inside windowsills no matter how often it was wiped away. And most quietly of all, the faces of the people themselves changed, not in features but in their expressions. The smiles became thinner, eye contact is shorter. Mothers kept children indoors even on bright days. When the traveling census man arrived months later and asked about burial records, he was told none had died that spring. Not one. When he asked about the 5 mounds, he was told they were soil tests. The ground had been prepared in advance, just in case. In Trenum, the truth was not buried. It was simply never spoken, never written, never taught. The bells had rung, yes, but that didn't mean they were meant for anyone in particular. That didn't mean anything had happened at all. Just echoes, just metal and wind. And when the census man left, he made a small note in his journal. He wrote, "5 unmarked graves, no recorded deaths, no explanation. Locals are evasive, eyes are avoidant, the parish is quiet." Then he crossed the village off his route and never returned. What he didn't see, what no outsider ever did, were the claw marks on the underside of the 5th coffin's lid. Deep, frenzied, and small. No one ever asked how long the child inside had lived after burial. No one even admitted there had been a child. And so the bells faded into memory. A sound that no longer held meaning. A sound no one would mention. But the earth remembered. The fog remembered. And beneath the soil something waited, not to be found but to be continued. Father Kreil arrived without fanfare, stepping down from the narrow stagecoach with his hands folded neatly in front of him as if already in prayer. His boots were polished, his white collar spotless, and his expression one of gentle, unwavering calm. The villagers of Trenum gathered loosely around the chapel steps, offering nods and cautious greetings, though few stepped forward. He greeted each of them with soft eyes and a voice that floated like warm broth. Slow, low, and careful, as though he feared waking something fragile in the air. His German accent, though mild, curled around certain words in ways that made them feel older, as if they belonged to another century. He said he had come to serve, not to be noticed, that God had no need for spectacle, only obedience. He thanked them for receiving him. And then he turned toward the church as if he already belonged to its stone and shadow. Inside the parish, he moved like clockwork. He dusted each pew by hand. He lit the candles in perfect order from left to right, never skipping, never hesitating. He rearranged the altar cloths until the folds were identical, the creases aligned like military seams. The townspeople watched from afar, unsure whether they were witnessing piety or compulsion. During his first sermon, he never raised his voice. He spoke in the same soft tone throughout, eyes lowered, hands unmoving. He spoke of the beauty of silence. How silence was not absence but presence, the truest form of listening. He said sin came from noise, from speaking too soon, from remembering things that God had already forgiven but man refused to forget. He smiled gently after he said this. No one smiled back. At first, the villagers found comfort in him. He never scolded, never cursed, never corrected anyone with anything but a patient gaze. Children said he never blinked when they spoke to him. Mothers said his hands were always cold, even near fire. And over time, a strange quietness settled into the town, not from fear but from imitation. People began speaking more softly. Questions became shorter. Conversations ended sooner. It was as if his presence reminded everyone that words were dangerous, that perhaps in silence nothing could go wrong, and perhaps that's exactly what he wanted. It began with the smaller things. A boy in the schoolhouse who couldn't remember his sister's name. A girl who forgot the path home even though she'd walked it every day since she could stand. At first, the parents blamed exhaustion or growing pains. They thought maybe the cold spring air was affecting their minds, or perhaps it was fever season again. But when the children began referring to their mothers as the woman who feeds and their fathers as the one who walks behind me, concern turned into a quiet fear. At recess, they no longer played games or sang rhymes. Instead, they sat in small circles and scraped strange shapes into the dirt with sticks. Spirals, reversed crosses, and figures with too many arms. When the teacher asked what they were doing, one child stared blankly and said they were making maps for angels. The town physician, a balding, weary man who had seen his share of infections and accidents, could find no physical cause. The children's eyes were clear, their pulses strong, no fevers, no signs of trauma. But he noted a dullness behind their gaze, a vacancy that didn't belong in faces so young. When he asked them to recite their prayers, they did, but in fragments, in twisted sequences and always whispering. One boy repeated a line from the Lord's Prayer over and over, omitting every third word. When asked why, he shrugged and said that was how the priest taught him to make room for silence. The physician, troubled, brought his notes to Father Kreil, hoping for counsel. Kreil listened with a soft expression and nodded as though none of it surprised him. Then he spoke of something he called divine renewal, how forgetting could be a gift from God, a way to empty the soul for rebirth. He explained it gently, as if describing a garden being cleared of weeds. When asked why it seemed to affect only children, he smiled and said children were closer to the source. That purity often demanded sacrifice. After that, things shifted inside the parish. Without official announcement, Kreil began separating the affected children during Sunday catechism. Instead of sitting with the others in the back pews, they were led through a side door into a smaller room where no one else was allowed. The parents, too unsure of themselves and too afraid to appear faithless, said nothing. They told themselves it was just temporary, that Kreil was helping them, that priests knew more about spiritual illness than doctors ever could. But those who lived closest to the chapel noticed that the children's shadows no longer moved like they used to. They walked slower, eyes unfocused, shoulders tense as if carrying burdens too old for them. One child was found at night standing in the middle of the town square barefoot and humming, his arms crossed behind him at an unnatural angle as though mimicking crucifixion. Some began to whisper in their homes behind shuttered windows, wondering if this was truly renewal or something else dressed in holy words. But no one confronted Kreil. No one dared accuse a man who never raised his voice, who spoke only of obedience, who prayed longer than anyone else in town. He remained a figure of calm, even as the children's minds unraveled like thread. And when a girl drew a spiral into her own palm with a broken slate shard, whispering that she was mapping her way back to the center, her mother scrubbed the blood away in silence and told no one. Because the priest had said forgetting was a blessing. Because the priest had said they were being made new. And because by then even the parents had started forgetting what things were like before he came. In the cold stone cellar beneath Trenum's parish, where the damp air clung to skin like breathless hands, Father Albinus Kreil began to write his own gospel. The room had once stored firewood and grain, but Kreil stripped it bare. He scrubbed the floor until the limestone turned pale. Then he sealed the tiny windows with waxed cloth, ensuring no sunlight could reach inside. Here, in the artificial dark, he constructed what he called corpus verso Dei, the body reversed of God. He filled leather-bound journals with spidery ink, each word a quiet dissection of sin, each page a blueprint for something far more disturbing than Scripture. In his theology, the soul was not healed through repentance but by subtracting memory from the flesh. He believed sin was not a deed but an imprint, a pattern of behavior etched into the muscles, nerves, and joints. To cleanse the soul, one had to erase the pattern, and to erase the pattern, one had to untrain the body. He wrote slowly, methodically, in a language only he understood, a blend of Latin, Old German, and something wholly invented. Each phrase was cross-referenced with a corresponding act. Flagellation was too common, too theatrical. Kreil believed in precision. A child who lied would be made to unlearn the motion of the tongue through silence and pressure. A girl who envied would walk for hours in small circles while blindfolded until the shape of desire disappeared from her stride. He tracked their progress in separate ledgers coded by symbols, no names, only shapes that corresponded to traits he wished to remove. A triangle for vanity, a spiral for memory, a jagged line for disobedience. He saw the human body as a manuscript covered in errors, and he considered himself the editor chosen to rewrite it. He fashioned tools with chilling care, a set of wire frames shaped like mouths to hold the jaw closed for hours. Wooden restraints were not for binding, but for retraining posture. Shoulders slouched in shame were realigned with splints to create an artificial state of humility. Some instruments were designed to introduce pain so specific that the mind could associate it with particular thoughts. If a child recalled their mother's name, the pain returned. If they forgot it, the pain ceased. This to Kreil was mercy, not punishment but divine recalibration. He called it cleansing by forgetting. He said he was not hurting them, only removing the scaffolding that held their sins in place. What terrified those few who caught glimpses of his doctrine was not the violence, but the logic, the cold, systematic reasoning behind every cruelty. He kept charts of progress marking down when a child stopped asking questions, when they stopped using I in their sentences, and when their sleep became dreamless. These were successes, he believed, signs that the soul was being softened for God's will. He described the human mind as a stubborn rope, too tightly wound with memory, and claimed his work simply loosened the knot. In moments of deeper delusion, he wrote that he was saving them from the burden of memory altogether. That forgetting one's own name was the final liberation, that the true image of God could only be seen when nothing human remained in the mirror. Above the cellar, life continued as usual. He gave sermons, smiled politely, and touched no one. But beneath the chapel, his doctrine grew. Each chapter is darker than the last. Each ritual is more exacting. He never called it torture. He called it preparation. He believed the world above had been built on the sin of remembering, and that paradise waited only for those who had been fully reversed. And in the cellar's perfect silence, as the candle burnt low and the ink dried, he began planning who would be next. He was known only as Joss, the mute stable boy who belonged to no family but was tolerated by most. His mother worked at the laundry house on the edge of town and was seen only in glimpses, hair always wet, eyes always lowered. Joss was small for his age, with limbs too thin for the labor he did. But he never refused a task. He couldn't. His voice had been gone since birth, or perhaps taken by something unspoken. He obeyed with nods and downcast eyes, fetching water, scrubbing hooves, and lifting things heavier than he was. In a town where silence had become a virtue, Joss's muteness was treated as holiness. Father Kreil noticed him early on. I noticed the way the boy never asked questions, the way his hands trembled when touched, the way he flinched when anyone raised a tool, even to work. Kreil began calling him to the rectory for private confession. Even though the boy could not speak, even though he had no words to confess, he called it soul listening. He said the absence of voice was an invitation to hear sin in a purer form. At first, the townspeople thought it was kindness. Joss returned from these sessions paler, yes, but cleaner and better dressed. Kreil had given him a black wool coat with silver buttons and stitched lining, finer than any he'd ever owned. He began sleeping behind the chapel instead of in the barn. His chores were lightened, but his eyes grew hollow, his movements slower. Sometimes he would walk in small circles behind the church, staring at the ground as though listening to something beneath it. Villagers saw bruises on his arms, but no one asked. When a child is silent and low-born, the world assumes they feel less, that their pain is less sacred, less urgent. Father Kreil said the boy was being prepared, that God had called him to something higher, that in silence transformation was possible. And then one morning Joss was gone. No warning, no goodbye, no trace except the coat, folded carefully on the chapel steps, but unnaturally heavy. When the town tailor opened it to see if it might be reused, 5 things spilled out. 4 wax seals marked with strange, unrecognized sigils, and 1 small collection of human teeth tied together with red string. None of the teeth matched each other. None were his. The room fell silent, and the items were quickly gathered by Kreil himself. He thanked them for their concern, smiled softly, and explained that Jos had departed to join a cloistered monastery in the north, where speech was forbidden and silence held as sacred law. No one could verify this. No letter came, no monastery name was given, and no one dared press further. Kreil ended the discussion with a prayer for Jos's journey. He said the boy had been chosen to ascend. His mother didn't argue. She didn't protest or scream or demand the truth. She simply stopped speaking altogether. Those who saw her after said her face had changed, not in shape but in weight. As if something heavy had moved in behind her eyes and settled there permanently. She no longer looked up. Her hands began to shake even when idle. She still went to the river and still beat the clothes against the stone, but she never lifted her gaze from the water, as if the current knew more than people ever would. Her silence was not mourning. It was surrender. Jos was never seen again. But after his disappearance, the cellar beneath the parish gained a new door, reinforced, with a small bolt only accessible from the inside, and at night some said they heard tapping, not loud, not rhythmic, just steady, like someone trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Behind the church, beyond the line where the official cemetery ended and the wild grass began to swallow the land, a new patch of earth appeared, unnaturally level, freshly turned and marked by 5 crude wooden crosses. No carvings, no names, just bare timber driven into the soil as if the dead beneath were not meant to be remembered. It wasn't part of any burial record. The priest said nothing during Sunday service. No bells had rung, no mourners had gathered, and no funeral procession had passed through the village square. Yet the soil was soft and dark, still damp in the morning fog. And the villagers, those few who dared walk past it, noticed something wrong in the silence there. The birds wouldn't land near it. Even the wind moved differently, as though avoiding it out of instinct. Some assumed these were the graves from that long-ago tolling of the bells. The 5 mornings with no mourners. But no one ever confirmed it. They simply remained, untouched, unspoken, waiting like open questions in a language no one could read. The truth came unexpectedly, carried on the breath of a stranger. A traveling undertaker passing through Trenum with an empty cart stopped to rest his horses and made idle conversation with the blacksmith. He mentioned the peculiar job he had done months prior, delivering 5 handcrafted pine coffins to the parish at the edge of town, all ordered sealed, all requested unfilled. Kreil had written to him personally, claiming it was a preventive ritual tied to an outbreak of disease. The undertaker had assumed there was a quarantine in effect, though no warning had been posted on any road. He had thought it odd, but not illegal. Priests often had their own rites, their own way of managing fear. He had unloaded the coffins by the side chapel and left without stepping inside. When the blacksmith asked what the priest had said about the plague, the man laughed. He said Kreil had simply smiled and said the danger was not from the outside, but from what still lingered within. Word spread in cautious whispers. No one had been sick, not that anyone could remember. No coughing fits, no deaths, no signs of fever or swelling. If there had been a sickness, it would have touched no homes. And yet there were 5 graves. 5 sealed boxes, 5 souls put to rest, or hidden. That's when the whispers shifted. People remembered the mute boy, the strange catechism lessons, and the children who forgot their own names. They remembered the wax seals, the teeth. And they looked again at those 5 unmarked crosses and realized they didn't need to ask who was buried there. They needed to ask what. But fear makes cowards even the brave. No one demanded the graves be opened. No one questioned the priest openly. Instead, they avoided the garden behind the church like it was cursed. They walked faster when passing it. Children were told never to play near it. The grass grew slower there, thin and brittle, as if something beneath was still absorbing all the warmth. The air around it stayed cool even in summer. And every now and then, someone would say they saw movement, not above, but in the earth itself, a ripple like breath or regret. Kreil gave no explanation. He continued his duties as if nothing had changed. When asked about the graves, he said they were a necessary measure, that sometimes to keep a village safe one must bury more than bodies. He never elaborated. He didn't need to, because by then the town had already learnt that silence was not absent. It was controlled. It was the soil where he planted his doctrine, and in the garden of unmarked crosses it was starting to grow. Miss Eliza Hartley had never been one to speak quickly or accuse without reason. She was the kind of woman who believed in order, in chalk lines drawn straight across a slate, in children who recited their lessons cleanly and sat with their feet tucked and eyes forward. But as spring pushed into summer, something began to change in her classroom. The children were quieter, not in the way that meant discipline had settled in, but in a way that made the room feel colder. They no longer whispered to one another when her back was turned. They no longer fidgeted or laughed. Instead, they stared, not at her, not even at the blackboard, but downward toward their own hands. That was what she noticed first. The hands, fingernails that had darkened at the base as if ink had bled into the beds. Small bruises on the pads of their palms. Circular, like the shape of coins pressed too long against the skin. When she asked one child if he had fallen or been struck, he looked at her blankly, as if the question itself did not translate. Another girl kept her fists closed during the entire arithmetic lesson, her knuckles trembling from the effort not to open them. Eliza watched carefully over the next few days. The bruises didn't fade. If anything, they multiplied. She noticed a pattern. The marks always appeared after Sunday. On Monday mornings, her students returned changed. Slower, quieter, their hands marked as if they had been used for something they could not explain. She knew of Father Kreil's separate catechism sessions, the closed-door lessons he gave only to the cleansed. The parents had accepted it with bowed heads and fearful eyes, telling themselves that the priest knew what was best for their children. But Eliza did not believe in blind trust. She believed in proof. So she waited until the afternoon when the parish was empty, when the windows glared too bright for anyone to notice a woman standing by the chapel's side door. She waited until she heard movement, until the low, rhythmic chanting faded into silence. Then she knocked once, twice. Kreil opened the door as though expecting her. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He invited her inside with a calmness that made her skin pull tight across her spine. The hallway was warm and smelt faintly of beeswax and something else. Coppery, sour. She told him what she had seen. The blackened nails, the bruised palms. She asked what had been done to the children during his catechism. His expression never changed. He said faith required pain, not as punishment but as passage. That belief was not a light to be switched on. It was a path, and that path ran through the flesh. He told her gently that hands were the first to sin. They reached for things they shouldn't, touched when forbidden, hide when truth demands exposure. And so, they must be taught. They must learn what not to feel, what not to remember. He said this with a smile, as if speaking of gardening or the making of bread. Eliza did not respond. She stood still for a long moment, watching the way his fingers curled slightly as he spoke, as if mimicking the very bruises he described. She left without another word. And though she told no one, not yet, and something inside her shifted that day. A line had been crossed, though she couldn't name it. But the next morning she brought a small knife with her to school, hidden inside her skirt pocket. She kept it there, not for protection, but to remind herself that some things must not be allowed to grow. Some teachings must be cut down before they take root. She no longer trusted the silence in her students' eyes, and somewhere deep within one, she began to understand that what the children were learning was not scripture, it was surrender, and that surrender had already begun to stain their hands. Eliza Hartley waited until the hour when even the dogs stopped barking. The village lay under a thick sky, stars dim behind the mist, as if the heavens themselves refused to witness what was about to be uncovered. She moved quickly but without panic, every footstep rehearsed, every creak of the rectory door anticipated. She had watched the priest for weeks, charted his movements, and memorized the patterns of his silence. She knew he retired at precisely the same hour each night, locking his chamber from within, his candlelight vanishing from the window as if snuffed by unseen hands. She entered through the side, the key swiped days earlier from the sacristy. The air inside was warm and stale, heavy with the scent of wax, smoke, and something sour that lingered just beneath, like old meat left behind stone walls. She moved past the chapel's pews and down the back hallway, where the wooden panels changed tone slightly underfoot. There, behind a linen-draped table, she found it, the cellar door flush with the floor nearly invisible. A rusted iron ring served as its handle, and when she pulled it free, the hinges moaned like something waking up. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved unevenly into the stone. She descended slowly, candle in hand, her breath caught between fear and fury. At the bottom, the space opened into a low chamber, the walls glistening with trapped moisture, the air cold and still as if it hadn't moved in years. Dozens of tallow candles burnt in copper bowls, their flickering light too steady, too rehearsed, like they had been trained to burn without hesitation. And in that glow she saw what Father Kreil had built. Along the far wall stood rows of glass jars sealed with black wax, each containing something suspended in murky fluid. Some were pink and pale, others were dark and shriveled. At first she thought they were roots or scraps of cloth. Then she saw the shapes more clearly. Tongues, dozens of them floating gently, each tagged with a faded strip of cloth marked not with names but with symbols, triangles, spirals, broken circles. Beneath them sat a row of tools lined up with impossible precision. Branding wheels made of copper etched with scripture, their handles dark with wear. Thin, delicate blades shaped like crescents. Small iron clamps engraved with reversed Latin phrases. None of it was random. Every object had purpose. Every surface whispered of preparation. At the center of the room, perched atop a wooden pedestal, sat a metronome. It ticked without pause back and forth, each swing a heartbeat in the dead air. Eliza moved closer and saw it wasn't mechanical. It had no springs or no weight. It moved by itself as if powered by the room's intent. Next to it, open on the floor, lay a book, handwritten in Kreil's cramped, obsessive script. The pages contained psalms rewritten backwards, line after line of sacred verses inverted and annotated. Margins filled with symbols she'd seen her students scratch into the dirt, some inked in red that had seeped through the parchment like open wounds. Along the bottom of each page were notations, the age, gender, and progression score of each subject. The handwriting was steady, not mad or frantic. This wasn't chaos. It was doctrine. It was a belief without mercy. She tried not to cry, not to breathe too loudly, and not to touch anything that might carry his scent. Her eyes darted to the corners, half expecting to find someone else watching her. Something breathing beneath the stone. But the room held its breath with her. The candles unbothered, the ticking unchanged. Time did not pass here. It waited. It crouched. And in that pause, she realized the truth. This wasn't the place Kreil used to punish. It was the place he used to reshape, not with rage, but with patience, not in haste, but through ritual. This cellar wasn't hidden because it was wicked. It was hidden because it was holy to him. And worse, it had been built not for one, but for many. As she crept back up the stairs, the ticking followed her, not louder, not faster, just steady, like the sound of something that would never stop, even after she left. In the months that followed, Father Kreil's doctrine transformed from hidden theology to a practiced ritual, sharpened into a blade too smooth to feel until it had already cut. He called it the Sacrament of Forgetting. It was not given, not offered, it was performed. Deep beneath the rectory and the cellar that no longer felt like a room but a sealed chamber of intent, the rituals became more exact, more elaborate. Kreil did not scream. He did not invoke fire or fury. Everything he did was quiet, measured. His voice remained steady even as the child before him writhed, restrained by silk cords he claimed were symbols of divine binding. The sessions began with hymns, not sung but hummed. Low and constant, reverberating through copper bowls placed along the stone floor. Each bowl held a mix of water, vinegar, and shavings from the branding wheels. The sound echoed unnaturally, creating tones that disoriented the senses. Subjects would become confused within minutes, their balance slipping, their gaze losing anchor. Then came the prayers, recited aloud by Kreil in a loop, not for comfort but for disintegration. Each verse was reversed, then spoken correctly, then reversed again until language itself became a weapon. He believed memory lived in rhythm, that the mind clung to patterns, not meanings. So he shattered the rhythm with contradiction. He introduced strobe-like candlelight controlled by a rotating lens and blended it with auditory hallucinations created by turning the metronome faster, slower, then abruptly stopping it. It was not random. He mapped the exact moment when confusion gave way to collapse. Then, while the victim's mind drifted somewhere between clarity and nothing, he would begin the second phase, the reordering of the flesh. Fingertips were pricked in a precise sequence, the small wound stitched shut with black thread, ears packed with wool soaked in pine tar. In some cases, the tongue was not removed, but instead sewn to the roof of the mouth with silk to teach the soul silence by force. He did not call these punishments. He called them guidance, the removal of the self to allow grace to enter. Every action was recorded in his ledger, each result tracked. And if the subject lost the ability to remember their name or repeat the year, he called it a divine milestone. Progress. The survivors were always returned. He made sure of it. But they came back different, not visibly broken, not screaming, just emptied. Their faces were calm, too calm, as if all recognition had been wiped clean. They responded only to their new names, ones Kreil had given them. Simple words like light, quiet, and vessel. Their families, terrified and confused, dared not protest. Kreil reassured them gently that these children had been reborn. That the pain had been real, yes, but necessary. And that the child they once knew had been full of sin and memory, and was now full of grace instead. He taught the families to accept this transformation as sacred. He told them to cherish the blessing of renewal. Most nodded, numb, too afraid to admit the horror they felt, too surrounded by silence to scream. Those who once questioned him began to falter. Because Kreil had changed the rules, he wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't denying the ritual, and that he was sanctifying them. And the town, slowly dying of its own cowardice, allowed it. The sacrament of forgetting became a whispered promise and a looming threat. It meant that no identity was safe, that no past could be trusted, that at any moment the priest could declare your memories unworthy, your selfhood flawed, and decide, with perfect calm, to start you over, to make you clean, to hollow you out and tell the world that you were better now, that you had been saved. By 1851, the church in Trenum no longer echoed with the sound of singing. The hymns had faded, the organ gone quiet, but still, during each Sunday Mass, 7 children stood at the front of the chapel, heads bowed, hands locked in permanent pose, lips closed with silver wire that caught the light like threads of frost. They were Kreil's choir. No one called them that aloud, but the name settled in the village like ash, the choir that sang no hymns. Each child had once been ordinary. Each had once belonged to someone, a mother, a father, a schoolroom. But through Kreil's rituals, the unmaking, the sacrament of forgetting, they had become something else entirely. Their new names were not spoken, only written in his private ledgers. The townspeople didn't know them. They referred to the children only by number now, 1 through 7. They never spoke, never broke formation, and never looked directly at anyone. And when the candles were lit and the pews filled with villagers pretending not to tremble, the children would begin to hum, low, sustained tones perfectly timed to the swinging arm of Kreil's metronome. It was not music. It was rhythm without melody and sound without soul, and yet it pierced the room with a sense of something greater than prayer, something deeper than worship, something terrifying. The wires that sealed their mouths had been inserted cleanly, the kind of surgical cruelty only a calm hand could perform. The stitches were thin and taut, glinting with oil to prevent infection. The seams along their cheeks formed small indents when they bowed their heads, as if their silence had weight. Their hands had been bound together not with rope but with linen soaked in beeswax and pressed tightly until the skin beneath fused slightly to the fabric. They were taught to kneel for hours without movement, to hold breath in perfect intervals, and to hum in unison until the pitch vibrated through the chapel walls. Kreil never stood with them. He stood behind them, watching, conducting without gestures. He told the parish that the choir was a living sacrament, a symbol of children reborn without sin, free from the burden of language and selfhood. He said they sang not from the throat, but from the soul, that their silence was purer than any verse, that their pain had become holy. The villagers, numbed by repetition and fear, accepted it, not gladly, not with peace, but with that quiet, collective cowardice that grows in places where questions are dangerous. Parents who still recognized the shape of their own child on the altar wept in private, but said nothing. One woman began sewing her fingers together at night in a state of trembling devotion, believing she too needed to be remade. Another man gouged out part of his tongue after claiming he had spoken too freely in his youth. They said the choir had shown them the path. The children themselves became more myth than flesh. They were not seen outside the church. They did not eat in public. Some believed they no longer slept, that Kreil kept them suspended in ritual, kept their bodies fed with broth and herbs, and kept their minds wrapped in scripture and rhythm until they could no longer remember what it meant to be alone. During Mass, one child would occasionally begin to shake mid-hum, and the sound would wobble slightly. But the others would hold the tone, steady and unwavering until the metronome corrected the error, until silence returned to perfect shape. No one asked what happened to the 8th. There had once been 8, but one Sunday there were only 7. Kreil offered no explanation. The town did not demand one. and the empty space in the choir line was never filled again. The remaining children adjusted the harmony. The tone became darker, heavier. The silence between them was more precise. And the parishioners, too afraid to grieve what they no longer had names for, sat straighter in their pews, hands folded tighter, eyes locked forward, listening to a choir that had no words left to give. Only vibration, only obedience, only the sound of a faith that had forgotten its own shape. The rain came without warning, not in sheets but in slow, endless waves, as if the sky had forgotten how to stop weeping. For 3 days the clouds held steady over Trenum, soaking every rooftop, every field, until the low grounds behind the church began to swell. Water filled the cemetery's edge first, rising like breath under the soil. By the 4th night, the wild garden behind the chapel, the same plot once marked by 5 crude, nameless crosses, buckled and split. The ground gave way with a wet groan, and what had been buried was pushed back into the world by the weight of water and time. The coffins broke open like rotten fruit, their lids cracked, their contents half submerged in the mud. It was a farmer's son who found them first, chasing a runaway goat. He returned pale and speechless, unable to describe what he'd seen. But by morning the whole town knew. Something had surfaced, something they had agreed, silently, collectively, to forget. The bodies inside were not decayed in the usual way. They had been preserved methodically, wrapped in linen soaked with wax and oil, their skin pale and rubbery beneath the layers. But it wasn't the preservation that stunned those who looked. It was the precision. Each corpse had been altered. The joints had been bent into unnatural poses, not from decomposition but by design. Fingers twisted backward, feet rotated as if walking in reverse. One body's arms had been dislocated and refastened along the spine. The faces had not rotted. They had been removed, cleanly, carefully, stripped of expression, of identity, leaving smooth, waxy ovals where features once were. And beneath the skin, strange things had been done. Layers of muscle cut and restitched into spirals, patches of flesh rearranged to create mirrored shapes as though someone had tried to redraw the human body from memory, and gotten it wrong on purpose. When the officials came, summoned from the county office 20 miles away, they brought shovels and silence. A small wagon carried tarps and quicklime. They told the villagers it was nothing more than medical refuse, the result of old anatomy experiments from before Kreil's time. They said the parish had once been used as a refuge for plague patients and that sometimes in confusion, unusual remains were buried without records. They told the villagers to stay inside and to pray for peace. But no one believed it. Not truly, because there were no scalpels in Trenum, no surgeons, and the cuts on those bodies had not been made for study. They had been made for something else, something spiritual, something cruel. Eliza Hartley watched from her schoolhouse window as the wagon rolled away with the uncovered coffins, each one now filled not with bodies but with ash. They had burnt them by dusk. The smell of smoke hung in the trees for days, and though no names were spoken, the villagers knew who had been unearthed. They had known from the moment the first coffin cracked. One of the mothers wept into her apron for hours, clutching a toy her child had long outgrown. Another man sat at the edge of the churchyard, carving deep lines into the soil with a stick, whispering apologies to the earth. No one challenged the lie. No one stopped the burial, because the truth was worse. The truth meant they had known, not the details, not the full horror, but enough. Enough to feel the weight of every silence they had chosen. That night, the metronome inside the rectory stopped ticking. Kreil did not come to Mass. The choir did not appear. The altar candles were lit but remained untouched, and though the town tried to return to rhythm, tried to restore the fragile illusion of order, something beneath their feet had shifted. Something sacred had been broken open. Not just graves, but the illusion that this place had ever been normal. The illusion that anything buried stays buried. On the final Sunday of that long, diseased season, Eliza Hartley stood at the back of the church with her coat still on. Her fists clenched in the folds of fabric and her breath short like she'd climbed too many steps. The pews were full, but no one spoke. No one turned to greet one another. The air was too thin. The metronome, once ever present, had not ticked in weeks. The choir had not been seen since the flood. The altar felt larger than it used to, too wide, too bare, and the candles burnt too clean, as if the flames knew they were being watched. When Kreil entered, his face was calm but pale, as if the color had been drained from him not by guilt but by something deeper. Something surrendered. He did not wear his robe. He stood in plain cloth, hands empty, eyes bright and unblinking. He looked not like a man walking toward justice, but like a figure arriving at his own coronation. He began speaking before reaching the altar. His voice, soft as ever, floated over the silence like dust. He welcomed the congregation and thanked them for their patience, their obedience, and their silence. Then he began to speak of subtraction, of purity through removal, the miracle of a soul made light enough to float. He said Trenum had been chosen because it knew how to keep quiet, because its people had already forgotten what it meant to question. He praised them for what they had allowed, for what they had buried. He said the choir had not been taken. They had risen. He said their bodies had been offered in perfect stillness, and that stillness had drawn God down from the sky and into the cellar. He said heaven had no names, only functions, no memories, only obedience, no mouths, only hums. He said he had birthed a small part of heaven beneath their feet, and that one day the world would follow. Eliza stepped forward. Her boots echoed across the stone. The sound alone made heads turn. She stood at the edge of the altar, eyes locked on Kreil. Her voice was not loud, but it broke through him like wind through cracked glass. She asked him where the children were. Not their new names, not their functions. Their names. She asked him if he remembered the girl who used to draw birds in her schoolbook or the boy who could balance a coin on his chin. She asked if he remembered their voices before he sealed them shut. Kreil didn't blink. He only smiled, not with joy, but with something worse, with peace. He said their voices had been unclean, that she had been too afraid to see what they had become. He said she, too, could be remade if she let go, that all things broken could be reversed, even her. What happened next was not loud, no cries, no violence, but 3 men rose from the back pews, sent by the diocese after the remains were found. They had been listening long enough. They moved toward Kreil not as guards but as handlers, as if they already knew what kind of man he was. Kreil did not resist. He folded his hands and bowed his head. He walked between them with the grace of a martyr and the silence of a tomb. Outside, a covered wagon waited. He was placed inside without cuffs, without chains, only a locked door. The townspeople were told he would not be tried, that he had been found mentally unfit for earthly judgment, that he would be remanded to the care of a private church-run asylum in the northern hills. His new name was Brother Sylvan, that no records would link him to Trenum, that the past would be buried again. Eliza watched the wagon disappear into the tree line. She did not cry. There were no tears left, only stillness, only the sound of birds returning to the trees after too many seasons of quiet. The parish doors were closed that day and the altar left untouched. No one swept the floors. No one lit the candles. And though the church stood for another decade, no priest ever stayed long. They said the ground was wrong, that their dreams turned strange, that the bell tower whispered at night when no wind blew. Eventually, the chapel was left to rot. The vines took it slowly, as if wrapping a body in green burial cloth. But nothing ever grew over the spot where the choir once stood. Nothing dared. By 1854, Trenum no longer resembled the village it had once been. The bakery closed first, its windows shuttered, its oven cold, the scent of bread gone from the morning air. Then the schoolhouse emptied, desks left dusty, chalk untouched. Eliza Hartley was among the last to leave, carrying no luggage but a single book, a ledger without names filled with symbols she had spent the last year trying to forget. The families that remained did not gather or speak openly. They passed each other in silence, their eyes hollow, their footsteps quiet on streets that no longer echoed. Some boarded up their homes and left without a word. Others stayed behind, but their lives became smaller, folded inward like paper pressed too many times. The parish still stood, but its doors were warped by rain, and no mass had been held since Kreil's removal. Children were no longer born there. Laughter no longer drifted from the windows, and though no one dared say his name, his shadow lingered. Not in the form of memory, but in absence, in what was missing, in what had been willingly unseen. The church itself survived another 50 years, its stone growing brittle with time, the bell tower leaning just slightly like a drunk refusing to fall. Over the decades, travelers passed through and asked about it, but locals gave vague answers. Some claimed it was abandoned after a fire, though no ash remained. Others muttered about a plague, though no record supported it. What none of them said, not once, not aloud, was what had truly happened. Not the rituals, not the cellar, not the children. It was easier and safer to let the place rot in silence. The diocese quietly sealed the parish's records in 1861, citing a clerical fire at the archive. But those who had lived through it knew that fire never touched those pages. They had been buried, on purpose, because no one wanted to remember how much had been allowed in the name of devotion. In 1911, a regional council ordered the church razed. They cited structural decay, but the motion passed with no debate. A team arrived with iron tools and wagons, and by sundown, only rubble remained. They cleared the foundation, removed the pews, and burnt the altar wood on the edge of the field. But they left one thing untouched: the patch of land behind the chapel where the unmarked graves had first appeared. The crew refused to dig there. The grass still grew unevenly, and the air still felt colder near the soil. One man, a foreman with no ties to the village, reportedly fell ill after standing too long near the old burial site. He left before the project was finished. No one replaced him. Later that year, a local ordinance was passed prohibiting unsupervised religious education. It wasn't spoken of directly, but the memory of Trenum had reached further than the town itself. In some counties, the word catechism began to carry a chill. And though no one could cite Kreil officially, his absence became a warning in itself. Proof of what could take root when silence was mistaken for virtue. The past was not erased, it was just left alone, left to molder beneath the surface of polite society, like rot beneath polished floorboards. Today little remains. The land is quiet. The trees have grown tall and close. A stone marker stands at the edge of the clearing where the church once cast its long shadow. There are no flowers placed there, no benches, no offerings. Only a plaque, barely weathered, set deep into the earth. It reads, 5 graves. No names. Nothing more. No mention of Kreil. No mention of the children. No record of what the parish once practiced. But for those who stop to read it, for those who truly see it, the meaning is clear. Not all horror wears a violent face. Not all monsters roar. Sometimes the most enduring evil is quiet, obedient, and dressed in white, And sometimes the worst sound in the world isn't a scream, it's a silence everyone agreed to keep.